Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, How to Run Meetings That Actually Work. Our presenter is Nicole Nash-Arnold. Nicole is a nurse educator and facilitator who helps transform accomplished clinical nurses into empowered and respected leaders. She shares her 15 years of experience in senior and executive health leadership roles to germinate great leaders, whether that's leading a team of fellow nurses on night duty or senior nursing executives. Nicole has over 10 years experience in the theatre, many years in education and postgraduate qualifications in nursing. Nicole, welcome to the microphone.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks very much. So welcome everybody who's joining us today. This webinar is about how to conduct meetings that actually work, because ultimately there is plenty to loathe about meetings. They truly are, when they're done badly, the most boring, epic waste of time known to man. And it's well known in the business literature that a meeting can take two destructive pathologies. One of those can be that it is used as a power source for those who are chairing the meeting, so that all the participants, if they know how to use their power correctly, so that they can dominate the direction of any given situation, project, outcome. And the other destructive force is that it is simply just a bottleneck. And in our world in healthcare, arguably in the public sector, is known for possibly being one of the worst offenders, where you've got subcommittees and working parties and full committees and chaired groups and other things that hang off the side, that is just meetings that connect with other meetings that connect with other meetings. And it just grinds decision making and progress to an absolute halt. But the worst thing about them is they're probably just so boring. And people look like these three creatures that they'd rather be folding fitted sheets than sitting in this meeting. The Harvard Business Review had a look at America and found that in America, organisations held 3 million meetings a year. That is a lot of meetings. And that executives spend 40 to 50% of their working hours, or 23 hours a week, in meetings. 90% of meeting attendees admitted to daydreaming in meetings. Something like 35% admit to having a little nap in the meeting. 73% of people acknowledge that they do other work during meetings, and 25% are spent discussing issues that are utterly irrelevant. So it's a pretty damning synopsis of why we spend time doing business in meetings. But we do it in healthcare as well. We kind of feel like we don't have that many. But when I was the assistant director of nursing, in any given month, I had a 2-hour nurse unit managers meeting for all of the nurse managers in the hospital, a 2-hour head of department meeting. We had an exec that went for often 4 hours. We had specialty M&Ms, morbidity and mortalities. And they each went for 2 hours. So we had one for cardiac and vascular, one for orthopedics, one for medical, one for ICU, one for ENT, urology, general and gynecology. There was an infection control subcommittee. There was a P&P subcommittee. There was a quality risk clinical meeting, quality and risk non-clinical meeting. We had staff development meetings. We had a theatre staff meeting that I went to, a cath lab staff meeting, an endo staff meeting. All in all, of my 160 hours per month that I worked in that role, 30 hours of it, so easily, and we're just locked away already, let alone anything else that might crop up along the time. So easily 30 to 50% of my time as an assistant director of nursing was taken up with meetings. And the research tells us that 25% of that time was spent on topics that were relevant, and probably a lot of the time I spent thinking about what I was going to make for dinner. Even our ward meetings, when you consider our ward meetings that we have, they will go for planned an hour, often spill over to an hour and a half. But even if we say you've got 60 hour, you've got an hour, they just spent an hour, and you get 10 people to your ward meeting, you can assume that in that room, your average cost per hour is $60. So your hourly rate plus your on costs, you're easily getting people at $60 an hour. So for 1 hour for 10 people, you're spending, a good $600 on that meeting. You do that every year, every month for every year, then you're now spending $6,000, which would be a tidy little Christmas party for everybody if the hospital donated the money for that instead. But if that hospital has 10 wards or departments, then you're doing that 10 times. Now you're starting to spend $60,000 on a meeting of having people come, sit, listen. So we really need to be using that time productively. And we need to get people to not just sit there and waste time and think about what they're having for dinner, but start thinking about what problems we can solve, what problems are facing each of our departments, and how we're going to solve them. Because what we can offer in that room is pretty productive. The nurse manager review unit doesn't have the situational knowledge that the nurses, including the ENs, AINs, the cleaner, the RNs, the senior RNs, everyone in that room has got a little piece of knowledge about how this department works that they could bring, and you could solve some amazing problems. It's not just sitting, being tortured in a meeting, but an opportunity to use it to make your department a truly great place to work. But sadly, we miss that opportunity of collaboration. And sadly, we miss that opportunity to solve some pretty amazing problems by just making some critical mistakes when we're running a meeting. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through 3 things. What are the top 5 mistakes that we allow to fester at meetings that we go to? How do we avoid confirmation bias, which is there are a few cognitive things that we allow to happen that are really prominent in meetings, which is just a meeting killer, a productivity killer, a collaboration killer, and makes meetings death. And the other thing is, how can we design an innovative meeting? If you're a nurse manager, then this is an amazing opportunity for you to shake the tried and true yet epically failed format of the meeting, of sitting in the tea room, and an opportunity to really shake things up. If you're clinical floor, then there is plenty of opportunity for you to take control and see opportunities for you to be able to direct this. So it's an amazing opportunity when it's done right, and it's just torture when it's done badly. So let's kick off with meeting monotony. There's a great quote about meetings. There's 2 of them that are my favourites. One of them is, not all meetings are bad, some are cancelled. And the other one, who was written by a quite famous American writer and humorist, who said, if you identify in one word the reason why the human race has not achieved and never will achieve its full potential, that word would be meetings. So it's universally accepted that meetings are just hateful things. And there are 5 main reasons why. So we're going to go through each of those 5 reasons, and then we're going to talk about how you might overcome that in your situation. Number 1, the dominators. Now, I'm not a major fan of meetings. I had a few of them and killed almost all of them off, except for those that I was legally required to have under EBAs or some sort of governance requirement. But I saw that happen all of the time, where the meeting was dominated but by a few usual suspects. They were the ones that always turned up to the meetings, and they were the ones that made 80% of the noise. And if you've ever gone to a single ward meeting or department meeting where you work, then this will resonate with you, where there's always the same people that turn up and they have the most to say. So the danger with that, aside from the fact that it's acutely irritating, that they dominate all of the discussion, is that you end up in a situation where, because they're very extroverted and very happy to take the floor and talk and have the gift of the gab, it means that you're getting the vote of 1 or 2 people. There might be 49 people that are working in that department, but in each and every ward meeting that you have, you're only getting the voice and the opinion of 2 people, and the same 2 people. But everybody walks away with that message because it's reinforced meeting after meeting after meeting. So it is a really destructive force, and it is the worst when you're sitting in the meeting and they just dominate and they rabbit on for hours. So if there are some people that will consistently speak more often and longer than others, the downside of that is that the rest of the crowd get pretty resentful and then don't come, and then you get an even smaller pool of people that are contributing in a valuable way. With limited time that we have the meetings that are actually gold, an amazing opportunity to make real change, to make a department that is amazing for your patients, and you've got this thing and it's being dominated by these people with their own agenda, then you've got to take control of that. If you're running the meeting, then when you open the meeting, you have to set the ground rules. And I know we've heard that before, but it's actually very rarely done. Let the group know that you want broad participation and that everybody has a chance to contribute to the topic. It's really important when you're chairing that meeting that you ask permission from the group to say, is everybody happy if I call on you during the conversation and the progress of this meeting to offer your opinion? Now, for the most part, everybody will probably not say anything, which is fine. If they say no, then take that on board. But for the most part, people will be silent and therefore imply that they're happy with that. So use that. You've been given permission. Don't let John and Jane take control of the meeting the whole time. Call on everybody else and say, tell me more for your perspective. What do you think about that, Angela? John and Jane have said X, Y, and Z. Angela, from your point of view, what about from your point of view, Ben? And what about from your point of view, Suzanne? And you just go through everybody in the room so that you start to dilute that very specific opinion. Tell people that you will not leave the topic alone until everybody has had their opinion. If they've turned up to the meeting, then they aren't just wanting to be a passive participant. They want to be involved, they want to hear, and they want to contribute. Allow them to do that. It'll put them on the spot, but once you've had many meetings like that, then everybody knows the rules and they know they're not going to get out of there without having said something, and you teach people how to treat that meeting. If you're running the meeting, then during the meeting it's important to pay full attention to each person's thought, even the dominators, because it's really easy for the dominator to just go on and on and on when no one's really listening and everyone's tuned out and they're just waiting for the litany and endless soliloquy to end. So, and it'll be really uncomfortable. It's important to encourage other people to do that as well, because it makes people feel more uncomfortable when people are really eye contact, fully engaged, and that will make them feel a bit more on the spot. And they should tighten up what their message is. If that's not the case, then you need to put some rules around those individuals. This takes some self-courage for you to be able to stop a meeting and stop someone who's on a roll and is clearly very comfortable at dominating in that space, and for you to be able to say, Jane, I really appreciate your input, but what I want to do is get some other people into this conversation, so I'm going to come back to you, okay? It's really important. And even when they try, when you get the next person in, they will try because they're very comfortable. And you've taught them previously how to behave, which is they're dominating, is par for the course. So you need to go back and go, no, Jane, I'm actually going to get everybody else's opinion before we come back to you. I'll leave you an opportunity at the end to contribute your thoughts, but I want to give everybody the opportunity to speak. So it takes some courage and it takes some discipline, but if you're chairing a meeting, then that's the responsibility that you've taken on. When someone gets cut off or interrupted, double back, go back to them and say to the other person, I know that there was something that you were going to add before you were cut off. Could you go back to that and tell the group what those thoughts were? After the meeting, if you've got some concerns that there were some other people then had something to say, then come back to them and let them know. And offline, I would like your participation to be more at the meeting. What can I do to help you do that? And for John and Jane, who are the dominators, John and Jane, I want other people and our contribution to be more balanced. And while I respect everything that you have to say, there are 10 people in this room, you are but 2 of them, we need it to be more balanced. So I'm going to wait in future, ask you to wait to the end so that you can have your contribution, if that's okay. Or I'd like you to allow the people who haven't participated to have that opportunity as we give you. So setting those rules with the dominator is really, really important to have a good meeting. The other thing that's a killer is the rubbish chair. So for someone who's running that meeting who is just terrible at it, then that is a meeting killer and ripe for terrible meeting monotony. It's often that your nurse manager just doesn't have the skills for it because no one's really taught this skill about how to have a meeting. In fact, there are so many things about being a nurse manager that you're not taught. It's not funny. So if you're a participant in this meeting and you've got someone who's chairing your ward meeting or any other meeting and they're terrible at it, then you need to take some control. One of the things that's really important is stepping up to the plate. And taking over part, if not all, of the whole process. Just because it's the nurse manager's ward doesn't necessarily mean that it's his or her job to chair the meeting. And they would be absolutely delighted if someone said, "Can I run the meeting?" They would be delighted. If you don't want to take on the whole thing, then you can go up and say, "May I prepare the agenda?" So you're not taking on the whole thing because you don't really want to sit in the chair and be the voice, but you can drive the whole process quietly from behind by taking over the agenda. So get topics from the group. You can actively run around to everybody while you're on shift and say, "Hey, I'm preparing the agenda for the next staff meeting. What topics do you want to have discussed?" You can identify the outcomes from each of those things. If it is, what's happening with parking? I'm late for every shift because we can never get a car park. And then you say, right, happy to put it on the agenda for us to find out or have some strategies. What would you like the outcome to be? Well, I'd like it to be that we have a plan or that we have a process that I let people know so that I'm late or understand what they want, or they want it escalated to the EBA. What is it that they want from that discussion? You can also suggest to your boss, to your nurse manager, an opportunity to perhaps ways in which they can run the meeting a bit better without telling them that they're rubbish at it. So you might be able to say at the beginning of the meeting, "So Joan, at the beginning of this meeting, there's a few things on the agenda that you've brought. What is it that you would like to achieve? How is it that you would like us to contribute? What is it that you would like us to do? What kind of input are you looking for here? And how will we know when you have what you need from us?" And it puts the chair in a position that makes them understand that it is not just a one-way conversation, and that you are giving that person permission to ask what they need. So it's a really good way of being able to direct it differently and getting it to be on the pathway to being more productive and two-sided. This is probably one of my pet hates about meetings, which is the memo monologue. Board meetings where people turn up with all of the memos and we read them out at the meeting. Here's the new parking. Here's what we're doing with the all uniform ordering. Here's what we're doing with the what we're buying next year. We're getting a bladder scanner and we're hoping to be able to buy a new ECG machine. This is what the new policies and procedures are coming out in the group from the Policy and Procedure Committee. It is just a litany of memos. And you have to ask yourself whether there was a better way of delivering that information. Because if there's no need for discussion or two-way collaboration, then why are we hearing it verbally when we could read it in an email or on a communication book or a memo board or a Facebook group or any other number of ways of communication? Is the worst habit of meetings, and that is absolutely what causes the 35% of people who've admitted to napping in a meeting. Worst thing known to man, because what is the point of you being in the room if you're just going to be lectured at around the latest information? So if you're being subjected to that, one of the ways that you can overcome that is by saying, and this sounds probably scripted in the way that I'm delivering it now, but in a way there's a couple of things in here that you want to be able to say by saying, Joan, I know that you've got high expectations for this ward and for us to be able to deliver amazing patient care. But one of the primary ways that you might be able to tap into the situational knowledge of this group that we know about what's happening in this ward and how we can best use that for that intel for best patient outcomes is this meeting. Joan, is it worth considering another way to share EVA updates and parking updates and uniform ordering information other than this meeting so that we can keep this time exclusively for brainstorming ward improvements? Again, one of the things that takes a bit of bravery by calling, you don't necessarily have to do that in the meeting. It can be offline before the meeting. But a really important, particularly if Joan's a pretty rubbish chair, sets Joan up for understanding what you expect and what you want. And if her community is saying, don't want the memo monologue and don't want this just to be just a one-way street, then she would be a foolish manager not to adjust to that. But if you don't tell her, she doesn't know that there's a problem. So you have to be willing to be able to say, no, memo monologue's got to go. One of the ways it can be helpful is ask some very specific questions. What does this group of nurses need to talk about? What are our vital initiatives and which of those are in jeopardy? Now you're going to have an enormous amount of data from what your hand hygiene audit says or what your medication areas trends are like, what your pressure injury trends are like, what your fall injury trends are like. There is more data in a hospital than you can poke a stick at, and most of that data never sees the light of day. Yet here you have a group of people at $600 an hour who can shed some really important light on why we think our oldies are falling over, and yet we're not using that. So this is a really good opportunity to have a meeting to be able to say, what's really important to us? Are we having falls all of a sudden? And do we need to sit together and just have a brainstorm about what's going on with all of the falls? Our population's aged a bit and all of a sudden, the ENTs are gone and they were young, fit, healthy people and they've been moved to another ward. And now we've got these orthopedics and some medical outliers and it's pushed our age bracket higher, we're having more falls. But you won't know that until you talk to the people that are literally on the clinical floor. And so you've got these people and you're getting a memo monologue about how to order a uniform. Not the time and place to spend that $600. It's a really powerhouse informational group of people that can solve some amazing problems, and it's not being asked. One of the questions might, what do we need to learn? Is that a good opportunity for you to be able to go, there's a great deficit in us understanding ECGs and we're having these problems. Could be great intel for your nurse manager to get that sorted. What do we need is a mutual understanding. What is it that we need to be really starting to focus on? Accreditation's coming. What do we need to really understand about that? What's keeping people up the department? Is the fact that there is no staff and we've constantly got agency and it's worrying people to come to work because it's diluted your confidence in the pool of nurses, then that's a topic for a discussion in a meeting, not how to order a uniform and EVA updates and what policy is coming out soon. Multitasking is a shocker. In the business world, then people bring their laptop and their iPhone and they sit there and send emails and review stuff. Nurses don't necessarily do that. But what they do is indulge in the distractions. For example, the ward nurse call or the team leader decked phone. And constantly getting up and down and in and out of the meeting is a meeting killer because it's distracting for the individual and it's disruptive for the group. So there is no way that the tea room is a very good place to ever have a meeting, because multitasking by jumping up and finding out what that nurse call is never going to be productive. So it's really important, if you're chairing that meeting, that you staff the ward sufficiently that you don't need the people in the room to be able to be going out on the ward. There's no way that a ward's going to function well if you've normally got 8 people and you're going to leave it with 2. That's going to be a meeting killer. So you have to do whatever you need to do to get extra people for that hour so that the people in the room can do that. The other thing, if you're chairing the room, don't do it in the tea room. Find somewhere else so that people can actually engage fully with the meeting. If you're a senior clinical nurse specialist, you're one of the senior RNs, then you being the one that's answering the deck phone and running out, it's not a great example, because what you're saying is this meeting is really unimportant and me answering this phone call, which might be about menus tomorrow morning, is more important than this meeting. So you need to set it up. Offline is really highly valuable to secure. It's rare as hen's teeth in our world. So if you're chairing the meeting, you have to say to people, I've secured the staffing for this ward. We've got this offline time. So don't answer the phone. Don't go and answer the nurse call. I want your full attention so that we can solve these problems that we've got. Give your attention to me and to others, and there are really no exceptions other than that emergency bell going off. Once that agreement's in place, you can even write this is a patient-free zone for this hour. It's a good reminder for people so that when they do go, oh, I can, here, I've just got to go and I forgot to give those antibiotics. Patient-free zone. Finally, the all talk, no action meetings. The ones where they just go around and we talk about the same things, nothing gets done. We return in a month, same conversation, nothing gets done. Come back in a month, same conversation, nothing's been done. No wonder people lose faith in the process. So you've got to have a really structured way that you are going to deliver on those outcomes. Most of the hospitals and health services have really good agendas which link action items and who's responsible in a time frame. So for the most part, that loop is sealed quite well in our worlds. What's not necessarily done quite well is the follow-up with the beforehand saying, now, Andrew, the meeting's coming up. You did commit to having the review ready for what our hand hygiene audit was looking like. Are you ready to bring that to the meeting, and are you able to come to the meeting? Because sometimes the participants can be a bit random other than the dominators. So making sure that the right people are in the right meeting at the right time with the right information so that we can keep that circle flowing and that loop getting closed. And that's something you don't need to be the nurse manager about, particularly if you've taken control of the agenda because you've got a rubbish chair, then you're the one that can be quietly in the background closing loops and getting people in the room so that they can have that information. Because otherwise it's like, oh, Andrew's not here with hand hygiene, hold that over to the next month. Oh, Andrew's not here, hold that over to the next month. Oh, Andrew's on nights, hold that over the next meeting. It's the worst. And it's just pointless exercise. So really make sure that you've got a system in place that delivers on meeting outcomes and not just no talk, no action. All talk, no action. I want to just quickly go through a couple of biases that are really common in meetings. And once they've been outed, you know them, recognise them, and hopefully you can kill them. They are cognitive bias. And which is defined as a set of predictable mental errors that arise from our limited ability to process information objectively. The human brain actually has a very limited ability to process information objectively. And that phenomenon was found in the 1970s by psychologists scientists called Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who did a study on why do people struggle to reason and judge objectively in certain situations. And these cognitive biases are thinking traps, and they're really, really common, and what they lead to is logical and irrational decisions, and we misjudge risks and threats. Now, one of the most common is the confirmation bias, that you favour information that supports your preconceptions. Now, consider a situation where you have been alerted to the fact that there's a trend in your ward for infections, total orthopaedic ward, and there's an infection. And you think that two of the orthopaedic surgeons are just rubbish. And aside from the fact that they're hateful creatures and rude and obnoxious, and there's very little that's likable about them, you are of the belief that because they're hateful creatures and terrible people and treat their patients with contempt or disregard, that they're probably going to be rubbish technicians as well. And so when you hear about their infections, you think, yeah, see, that's consistent. They're horrible people. I'm not surprised they're terrible technicians as well. You haven't used a logical framework for making that decision. You haven't reviewed who the infections are, any of the processes, any other the changes. Perhaps there's a CSD problem. Perhaps there's a break in the operating theatre technique. Perhaps there's a new scrub nurse in the orthopaedic wards who's terrible and just ragingly incompetent and contaminating fields left, right and centre. There are so many reasons why that could be. Perhaps we'll find out later that there was a problem with the orthopaedic instruments that we purchased as one-offs and they were not sterilised. But you've seen enough information to go, yeah, that's consistent, confirmation bias. So you seek information that supports your preconception that these guys are goats and of course they're going to be rubbish technicians. It happens all the time. And if you take a note of what sort of confirmation biases that you see in your environment, you'll see it all the time once you know about it. That people have made links between A and B that aren't there, but they've used information to support that, even though they've been very discreet or selective about the information. And if there's something that doesn't fit, then they just ditch it and go, oh, that's irrelevant. But everything else is relevant because it supports my preconception. In a meeting, it happens all the time as well, where we announce something or open something up for discussion, and there is a confirmation bias where people just want to hear the pieces of information that supports their preconception. If that's happening in a meeting, then you need to seek out the team members who offer really different points of view and have really different risk tolerances and have a very different perspective, because that will lead to an open and balanced discussion. There will be people in that room that are happy to say, yes, those two orthopaedic surgeons are contemptuous creatures and they're rude all the time, but they're not terrible technicians, and just because they're terrible doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad technicians. We need to look deeper and see whether there's something else going on. And that will open up to a healthy conflict and an open discussion. But finding people in your room that's happy to challenge and are comfortable having a good debate and are comfortable testing the logic behind people's preconceptions is really powerful to having a balanced meeting. The other thinking trap that happens is anchoring, where we unconsciously gravitate to an argument, opinion, solution, option that we hear first. So for example, the nurse manager in a meeting that you say might come to say our nursing hours are being reduced, we're going to redo the roster. One of the things that we might do is increase agency, recruit more staff, do training, deploy from other wards, blah, blah, blah. And people will go, let's go agency, because it was the first thing that they heard. And all of that that came after was just noise. So to overcome the fact that when you're in a meeting and you're chairing it, you have to deliver one thing first, then you can assume that people, because of the thinking trap, that they're going to latch onto that first one. then you need to structure it in such a way that you can make sure that they consider dot point number 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, and not just latch on to number 1 because it was the anchoring effect and the anchoring bias. One of the good ways of doing that is giving people the information before the meeting so that they can read, think, digest, they can marinate in the options for a while, and then one of their preferred options will float to the surface that will be more than just with the first one that I heard. The other one is the bandwagon bias, similar to groupthink, if you've heard of that term, but ultimately it is the tendency of a group to form an opinion because others already done so. So it's hopping on the bandwagon. It happens all of the time in meetings, particularly the most dangerous part about your dominators in a meeting is if they dominate and go, yeah, we should just get more agency, that's definitely the solution, then everyone's going to go, oh, okay, well, if that's what the group wants and if that's what the group thinks, I'll just go with that because it's easy and I'll just go with the flow. And so they'll just go with that solution because it appears to be what the group wants. But actually you've heard the voice of 1 or 2 people and it's not the bandwagon, it was just the noisiest one. Or even in that people just don't want to have conflict. Using those techniques to make sure that everybody has their voice heard is really, really powerful because then it will be clear that there is no bandwagon or not necessarily a bandwagon and that there are other options and that each of those options hold value and that you as a group need to toss around those options before you just jump on the popular one because the popular one often isn't the best one and it may end up with you misjudging risks, making assumptions that you haven't thought through just because everybody wanted to go with the flow. It's really important in terms of overcoming the bandwagon is to keep the numbers as low as possible as well. Because the greater number of people in the room means that the quieter that you're going to have. And a lot of people sitting in the background, particularly the introverts, that are just going to go, oh, okay, so those people have spoken, then that must be the way that we should go with it. And the larger the group, the more the introverted people are not going to be willing to have their voice heard because it's risky and it's confronting for them. And they'll assume that their opinion doesn't matter or that it's already been heard. So lower the barriers of entry for the introverted people because just because they're introverted doesn't necessarily mean they don't have absolute gold to share. So you want to keep it as low and so that you can keep it as representative as possible. But that is a really important strategy. Otherwise, it's just a free-for-all for the very noisy extroverts. If that's not possible, then do it differently. Don't do a meeting where everybody's sitting in the room and has to speak up in that format. We're going to talk about some options later in disrupting the same old meeting format. But here, when we think about Notes Day, when we talk about that shortly, and the World Cafe, when we talk about that shortly, in being able to find a way for people to have their voice heard that isn't confronting, as putting their hand up in a big group and saying, I think this. For you, when you're chairing a meeting, it's important to recognise who the different thinkers in the rooms are and bring their opinion. There are always those people in the ward that you're just like, oh, they're so different to us and where do they come up with those ideas, and they have some really kooky ideas. Bring those thoughts to the fore because while 9 times out of 10 they might bring the most harebrained, bizarre suggestions, sometimes they're going to bring some absolute gold as well. And so rattling the cages and disrupting the norm is really productive. The other thing, if you're in a big group and you can't keep the group numbers down, then when you're chairing a meeting and you're asking for opinions or you're asking for what people wish to happen, ask them to write down their preference before the group speaks, because that will kill any opportunity for them just to go, oh, I'll just go with it. And then and when you have that, then you'll have an idea of what the benchmark was before discussion, and see whether it swayed because of the noisy few. The last one is hindsight bias. Now, this is something that you look back retrospectively where people wrongly believe that they knew that that would happen. That was always going to happen when they look back, even though they really didn't at the time. So it's really easy for people when something goes wrong for them to turn around and go, yeah, it was always wrong. It was always going to be a disaster. Yeah, reducing the hours was always going to result in X, Y, and Z. Yep, that new uniform, always going to be a disaster. Never was going to work, even though at the time, they never thought that at the time. So there is a sense in hindsight bias that the outcome was certain and obvious and expected. What's the problem with that is it makes it really hard for people to look objectively at a problem and unpack what went wrong when they are reviewing the situation. One way you can use to unpack that is use experts. So if you've got a slew of wound infections in your ward and everyone's like, yep, that was always going to happen for whatever reason, the hindsight bias is, we've got these older patients now, it's always going to happen. Or we've got these new students and really young grads that don't know, it was always going to happen that we were going to have all of these wound infections, when they're making an assumption in hindsight bias. So getting an expert, getting a stone therapist down to the unit to be able to offer expertise that it isn't just because and always going to happen, and challenge that logic, and that flawed logic can be really powerful. And do what you can to increase people's knowledge about an issue so that they can understand the wider context. If it was the nursing hours are reduced and we redid the roster, get them to understand the case mix has changed and we don't really need that, or that, we've got more senior staff and less junior staff, more RNs and not air. All of the other factors that aren't just, yep, that was always going to be a disaster. Finally, we're just going to run through a couple of strategies for how meetings will work. And one of the most powerful, which is one of the things that I spend a lot of time in my world with nursing education, unpacking, is the concept of cognitive diversity. And if you use the principle of cognitive diversity in that you recognise and value that people think differently and bring different perspectives, then a lot of the problems that we see in meetings are instantly going to go away. In that the dominators are going to be neutralised a bit, because you understand that the voice of one or two of the same people does not represent cognitive diversity. So you're going to be really motivated to hear the others, and because they bring unique perspectives. And the Memo monologue, it's not meetings should be a dialogue, and to have a dialogue you need different thinkers and different perspectives so that you can have healthy challenge and pick apart the logic, which is the same with all of those biases. The cognitive biases means that confirmation and anchoring and bandwagon and hindsight biases come from a place where we've made assumptions and not used our full brain. So using this is going to be really important. And so who are we as thinkers are really four things. That those of us who use our left brain tend to be more rational thinkers, as opposed to those of us who use our right brain tend to be more intuitive, and you rely on intuition more than anything else. The other thing that there are a certain group of people that don't just use their left hemisphere over their right hemisphere. Then there is the theory of thinking that is called the triune brain theory, that the brain is made up of three parts: cerebellum, reptilian, central services only. Not a lot of thinking goes on there, but also the limbic brain and the cerebral thinking. And so that cerebral thinking is the intellectual part of what we do. We use that broader mass of the brain to higher order executive function, memory, and thought processes, as opposed to that limbic brain that is used for more instinctive work. that we can instinctively feel that something's not going on. It's got no capacity for language, that bit of the brain. And it is a very small part of the brain, and it intuitively feels danger. It's responsible for the flight, fright, freeze response, and responsible for us intuitively understanding that there's danger and forces us to take corrective action, and responsible for emotions. So it's when nurses walk into a room and you look at a patient and you go, oh, geez, we're in trouble here. But you can't necessarily articulate why. And the data, their OBS, vitals, bloods, x-rays, whatever, doesn't necessarily support that feeling in your gut. There's intellectual thinking with your head, the instinctive is your gut, but actually what it is the limbic part of your brain. So people use these ways of thinking. And so when you combine the intellectual thinking with the rational, then you get people who are very analytical. When you combine the rational with the instinctive, then you get people who are really, really practical. And when you combine the intuitive and the instinctive, then you get people who have got an intuitive sense about how people feel about a situation. And then when you combine the intellectual and the intuitive, then you get people who are experimental, think big picture, see the vision. And all four of those people are going to turn up to your meeting. Yet it is possibly the relational people who are naturally good talkers, naturally good speakers, that may dominate your meeting. But those that are analytical, practical and experimental may not get their voice heard. So it's really important to think about how you're going to manage that. Because in a meeting, the blue people, the analytical, they want to be efficient, they want to focus on the bottom line, they want things to be succinct, they want clear descriptions of goals and objectives, they want you to provide appropriate data, they plan the analysis, they love a good debate, and they love critical decisions. The green people in your room are going to want consistency, they really want that meeting protocol because they're very practical and they're very rational, so they enjoy the practicality and the protocol. They want a detailed agenda. They want to take notes. So here's a tip for a great meeting. Give your person that you think is the most practical person in the room the job of the minutes. They'll actually really love it. They'll want to establish outcomes and action items of the who, what, when, where. So they're fantastic for being able to take the agenda because they have a unique ability for facilitating and getting things done. They'll want you to stay on track. They don't want side conversations. They don't want it to go off on a tangent. They want it to set the agenda to be stuck to, and they want clear roles, which is contrastly different to the red thinkers that are relational, that want to connect with everybody, and they want to encourage everybody to have a chat, and they want to chat or talk. They want to include diverse people, the ones that use their talking for good instead of evil. They love a comfortable room, they want to have food, they want to bring a coffee, they want it to be convivial, they want people to feel connected with each other, they want time for people to share and build trust and love things to be spontaneous and informal. And here they're quite different to the greens. Whereas the yellow thinkers are great brainstormers. They want to get out of the box, provide variety and an opportunity for brainstorming and concept discussion and the free flowing of ideas and the vision and the discuss the future. So you're going to have all four of those people in the room, and so you need to be thinking about how you're going to have a meeting that works for all of them. And by doing that, you're going to get robust discussion free from the cognitive biases that isn't a memo monologue. It won't be happy families. You are probably going to spark some really robust debate and challenging of logic. Good. Provided we're not cows to each other and rip each other's faces off, conflict is a really great thing. That's where great ideas are made. So don't let conflict restrict you. In fact, spark it. So when you want to build the perfect meeting, then you have to determine how you're going to do that. So the first thing to do is determine for you, when you're chairing the meeting, determine what you want to accomplish. If you go there unprepared, then it's just going to be a memo monologue and a one-way conversation. So what is it that you want to do in this meeting? Do you want to solve a problem? Do you want to fix something that's broken? Do you want to make a plan? Are you trying to make a decision? Are you sharing information, or are you collaborating? What is this meeting for? It may have other things, but ultimately you've got $600 is sitting in the room for an hour of people with absolute gold in their heads that you want to tap into. What do you want to do with it? What's the most pressing need? Step 2 is then determining the best format for that. Please leave the tea room. Tea rooms are for drinking tea, not for having meetings. They are just so counterproductive. Find a conference room, have a stand-up meeting. An off-site meeting is a conference call, a Google Hangout, or a Skype meeting, so that people who aren't in the building but have got their kids at home they can't get childcare for, is it worth spending time in setting up a Skype chat so everybody can be contributing. Everyone's got a smartphone now, so then there's no reason stopping you getting everybody in on FaceTime or whatever format that you are going to choose. Is this something that's a one-on-one meeting, that you've had one issue with one person? Don't make it about the group. Some things are emailed. If it was information sharing that is what you want to accomplish, maybe send it in an email. Set up a Facebook group or an online chat or some other way, unique way. The communication book, the age-old communication book, is not without its benefits when it's done well. A board, a communication board, some other way than having a meeting for information sharing, but determine what your best way of achieving that is. Step 3 is design your agenda with your mission in mind. So have a walkthrough. You're going to have a welcome. First thing you're going to do is set the scene and define the mission from the outset. Determine what you want to accomplish. Why are you here? And then execute a strategy to deliver on that message, on that mission. If you're trying to solve something that's broken, for example, you've had a stack of falls and it's a real issue for the department because they're getting out of control, and you've had one near miss that was almost a sentinel event, set that from the beginning. We need to work out what's going on with our falls and then execute a strategy to deliver on that mission. We're just going to brainstorm. This whole thing is we're going to brainstorm and have a look. Here are all of the incidences. Here are all the incident reports. We're going to throw them out on the table. We're going to review them, and we're going to brainstorm what we think is going on, how we're going to fix it. You can review data. You can collaborate. You can do a whole load of stuff, but execute on a strategy and design your agenda with your mission in mind. And then consider how people think. So you know who hopefully is going to come to your meeting. You've gone to them before. That's one of the keys to getting them to the meeting. You've crafted your agenda. You know what the mission is about. You've told everybody what it's about and some options, because you don't want confirmation bias and you don't want them to anchor to the first solution for the falls that they hear. So you've given them some options, given them an opportunity to research. Think about how each of them think. Because ultimately what you want to do is to get them thinking more broadly than just passively sitting in the room thinking. So think about who's the analyzer, who's really good at data and can just look at all of the falls data and has a unique ability to see the patterns in that data. Who's really practical and is the time Nazi in the room and will be really good at keeping it on track and has no qualms about going, no, we're getting off track. No, this is what was about. No, getting on time. Who's the time Nazi and use their skills for good? Who are the real feelers in the room that are going to make sure that everybody's included and thinks about who things are good news for and bad news for, and have that in your back of your mind? And who's the mad scientist that comes up with the kookiest stuff known to man, and yet some of it's amazing and really challenges what people think, where people will go, okay, well, that's crazy, we can't do that. But maybe we could do it a bit like that and do it in this more practical way. The yellows are fantastic for harebrained ideas. Practical, the green people are the great ones to be able to take those harebrained ideas and make them into something that is worthwhile and usable. Now, one thing that I just mentioned in that was determine the best format. And I'm just going to run through while we finish a couple of things that are new and unique ways of having a meeting instead of sitting in the handover room or the tea room and having a meeting, which is a meeting killer. I think it was Google that invented the stand-up meeting. They got rid of all of the chairs and they would stand up and make people uncomfortable in that they didn't just passively sit back and think about what to be made for dinner tonight. It also meant that it wasn't, it was a bit informal, and we would have this habit of putting a meeting in the diary that was an hour long, even though it maybe needed to be 10 minutes or maybe it needed to be 3 hours. So the stand-up meeting was fantastic because it didn't anchor to those preconceptions where we're sitting down, it's going to go for a meeting, we're going to drone on about all of this information. So it was quite unique. Now, the stand-up meeting you may see really commonly because we've adopted it quite a lot in nursing, except we call it the scrum or the huddle. But essentially what it is just a relaxed, dynamic meeting that is very purposeful and very situation now. And so it's starting to get real momentum for being really powerful in health departments and wards and units all over Australia to be able to find out where people are at today and what they need. So a really productive way of having a meeting that we've taken that Google idea and made it very real in our worlds. The pitch for change, and I've put here the old Shark Tank for those of you who have seen the show. Nurses have got situational knowledge that the executives of your hospitals don't know. There is so much about the world, that their world and the details, they just don't know. Aside from the fact that we have access to nursing journals and can see some really amazing ideas that have been used in other departments, other countries that are really productive and really inspirational, that will have great impacts for our patients and great outcomes for our hospitals, yet they never see the light of day. And so making a pitch to not necessarily the Shark Tank on Channel 10, but replace that Shark Tank with your executive team and make a pitch in the same way, and you've got a meeting format that's really powerful that brings nursing ideas. Even in you could do that in your ward with not the Shark panel and not the nursing executive, but your nurse manager and a couple of your clinical nurse specialists. And people come and pitch ideas to real solutions, to real problems that are going on. Is the real problem the roster, that it just doesn't work? There are lots of people that pitch ideas, they just do it in the tea room. So if you'd formalise a way that you're going to have a pitch fest and it's going to be here and everyone's invited to pitch their idea and the best one wins, it could be a really great fun way of having a meeting, and it's about solutions because goodness knows we've got plenty of them. Pixar made this one famous that I think it'd be amazing for nursing, in that they regularly have a notes day, and it's an internal day where employees gather in little groups, very informal, like what you can see here, and they start on their own trusted group and about whatever problem is of the day. Say it's staffing or recruitment and retention of nurses in the hospital. So they start on their own team, and then different departments are brought together to think about those really relevant issues or challenges of the organisation or the hospital. And so slowly over time, you start to break away from your known and trusted group and start talking to other people from other departments, and that idea sharing starts to take form and patterns start to theme, and then everyone starts to hear about some really good ideas and some really great concepts. It gives the opportunity for those people who are introverted, who don't like their voice to be heard, yet it gives them a really low risk way of being heard. Now, you could easily do that in a department. In fact, it's probably the best way to have a meeting because it can be done over time and it doesn't have to be every Tuesday at 2:30, where people who work nights, weekends, other days never get access to that meeting. And it's something that is, if you can find a unique way of being able to share those discussions, that person can go and have it. I'll have this conversation with the night staff when they come on, and then the night staff have given time to have it with the morning staff. You can have a meeting that goes on for a week in that whole concept of the notes day, where people, that little group writes their notes around that topic, and then it gets shared and progressed. It doesn't have to be just an hour. The fishbowl is a fantastic concept, that a very effective methodology for a debate when you've got something where a small group of participants, and you can see 3 of them, are sitting in the middle with a whole load of silent participants around the room, and the circle being the fishbowl, watching those 3 women in the centre having a conversation. And these 3 discuss the topic of the day. What's going on with our falls? And they have a discussion. The fishbowl listens without interfering or interrupting. And then someone scribes their ideas, and then other people change in and change out. And so slowly you replace someone, and then they have that discussion, and everybody ends up contributing. It's a very free-flow form of ideas, but it gives everybody the opportunity to be heard, and it's a much more organic way of having a discussion, other than the chair having a memo monologue. Sometimes if you want to conclude your whole group, or sometimes there's an issue that presents to the whole hospital, and the World Cafe is a really great concept too. It's a creative process where people sit around at bar tables and split into small groups of 4 to 6 and discuss the topic. And then the group each table shares their group concepts to the larger group, and then it evolves over time. Now you can see a guy drawing it all up there as each table. And you end, in this particular, they've got a graphic facilitator, so an artist that's come in for the day to draw up what people are thinking, which science tells us that we are much better at internalising a picture like that than we are minutes, because that presentation style can be really effective. So there are a few ideas around what, not just sitting in the tea room with a memo monologue, that you can do for meetings. So your mission now is to go away and think about those confirmation biases and see them in action. Go away and think about those ways that people think, and see if you can unpick them. Who are the analysers, who are the practical, who are the feelers, and who are the ones that come up with kooky ideas, and think about what kind of voice they get in your meeting. And then go away and think about how you're going to disrupt the current process. So I hope that's been really helpful, and you can have a much more effective meeting in the future. I'll see you next time.